October 14, 1943. Sobibor extermination camp, occupied Poland. SS Oberscharführer Johann Niemann, deputy commandant of the camp, walked toward the tailoring workshop for a routine inspection. He was expecting to examine a new leather coat that Jewish prisoners had been ordered to make for him. It was 4:00 p.m., and Niemann was looking forward to trying on the coat before the evening roll call. What Niemann didn't know was that the fitting had been carefully planned. In the workshop, Soviet Jewish prisoner Alexander Pechersky and several co-conspirators waited with axes hidden behind their backs. This wasn't a tailoring appointment, it was an execution. And it was the first move in the only successful mass escape from a Nazi extermination camp in history. Within 90 minutes, the prisoners of Sobibor would accomplish what the Nazis thought impossible. They would overthrow their guards, breach the fences, and escape into the Polish forests. Roughly 300 prisoners would survive to reach freedom. The camp would be destroyed and never reopened. And the systematic elimination that had claimed 170,000 to 250,000 lives at Sobibor would stop forever. But the story of how prisoners in a facility designed for mass destruction managed to organize, plan, and execute a successful uprising contains layers of complexity, tragedy, and extraordinary courage that challenge everything we think we know about resistance under impossible conditions. Sobibor was established in March 1942 as part of Operation Reinhard, the systematic effort to eliminate the Jewish population of Poland. Unlike Auschwitz, which served multiple functions including labor and imprisonment, Sobibor had one purpose: immediate extermination. Prisoners who arrived at Sobibor were usually deceased within hours of arrival. The camp was small, roughly 400 meters by 600 meters, and isolated in a forested area near the Bug River. The design was efficient and brutal. Arriving prisoners were told they were at a transit camp and needed to shower and be disinfected before continuing their journey. They were separated by gender, ordered to undress, and directed down a path the prisoners called the Tube, or the Road to Heaven, a fenced pathway leading directly to gas chambers disguised as shower facilities. The entire process from arrival to extermination took about 2 hours. Bodies were initially buried in mass graves, then later exhumed and burned to destroy evidence. A small group of prisoners, roughly 600 at any given time, were kept alive to operate the camp, sorting confiscated belongings, maintaining facilities, cutting hair from female victims before extermination, and disposing of bodies. These prisoners lived under impossible conditions. They knew they were temporary. Once they were no longer useful, or once the camp's purpose was fulfilled, they too would be eliminated. They witnessed the arrival and extermination of thousands daily. The psychological weight was designed to break them, to make resistance unthinkable. SS guards encouraged this despair through random violence and a system of collective punishment. If one prisoner attempted escape, multiple others would be executed as a deterrent. The message was clear. Any resistance would cost not just your life, but the lives of those around you. Better to survive another day than risk dooming your fellow prisoners. For 18 months, this system worked exactly as designed. Prisoners arrived, were processed, were exterminated. The workers who kept the camp running remained compliant, knowing that resistance meant certain termination not just for themselves, but for others. Several individual escape attempts occurred. Prisoners who realized their fate and made desperate runs for the fences. All were captured and executed publicly as examples. Then in September 1943, something changed. A transport arrived from Minsk containing Soviet prisoners of war, including a Jewish Red Army lieutenant named Alexander Pechersky. The SS guards didn't immediately recognize what they'd done by bringing Soviet POWs into Sobibor. They thought they were just processing another transport. What they'd actually done was introduce trained soldiers, men who understood military tactics, command structures, and collective action, into a population of civilians who had been systematically demoralized. Alexander Pechersky was 33 years old, physically fit despite months in German captivity, and most importantly, he was a trained military officer. Within days of arriving at Sobibor, other prisoners noticed something different about him. While most prisoners moved through camp with heads down, avoiding eye contact with guards, Pechersky walked with military bearing. He followed orders efficiently, but without the broken spirit that characterized most prisoners. Other prisoners, particularly those who had been in Sobibor longest and understood the system, began quietly approaching Pechersky. They told him what Sobibor really was, not a labor camp as he might have assumed, but an extermination facility. They told him that everyone, including him, was living on borrowed time. They told him about previous escape attempts and why they'd failed. And they asked him a question: could a Soviet military officer organize what desperate individuals could not? Pechersky faced an impossible decision. In Soviet military culture, surrender was considered betrayal. Soviet POWs who survived German captivity often faced suspicion upon return. Why had they survived when others hadn't? Organizing a prison uprising might seem like redemption, but it also meant taking responsibility for potentially hundreds of lives. If the uprising failed, everyone involved would face immediate execution, along with random prisoners selected for collective punishment. But Pechersky was also a Jew, and he understood what Sobibor represented. This wasn't just a prison camp where prisoners might eventually be liberated or exchanged. This was a facility designed to eliminate his entire people. Every day he delayed meant more transports arrived, more people perished. There was no morally safe choice, only the choice between action and complicity through inaction. Pechersky began carefully recruiting. He needed people he could trust absolutely, because one informant, one prisoner too broken to keep a secret, would doom the entire plan. He started with other Soviet POWs from his transport, men he had known, who had military training, who understood operational security. Then he expanded to long-term Sobibor prisoners who had skills and knowledge about the camp's operation. One critical recruit was Leon Feldhendler, a Polish Jew who had been in Sobibor since early 1942 and had emerged as an informal leader among the prisoners. Feldhendler had been contemplating resistance for months, but lacked the military expertise to plan an uprising. Pechersky had the expertise but lacked knowledge of the camp's routines and vulnerabilities. Together, they formed a command structure that combined military planning with institutional knowledge. The planning took weeks. They had to be extraordinarily careful. Guards watched constantly. Prisoner capos who collaborated with the SS could report suspicious activity, and even well-meaning prisoners might inadvertently reveal plans if they knew too much. The conspiracy operated on strict need-to-know principles. Most prisoners wouldn't learn about the uprising until it was actually happening. The plan they developed was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its requirements. They couldn't fight the SS guards directly. The guards had weapons, training, and reinforcements available from nearby military installations. A frontal assault would fail. Instead, they would use the camp's routines against the guards. SS officers regularly visited workshops where prisoners worked, the tailoring shop, the carpentry shop, the shoemaking shop, to have items made or to inspect work. These visits followed predictable patterns. An SS officer would arrive, dismiss his guard escort to avoid having enlisted men see officers being fitted for clothing or selecting items, and would be alone with prisoners for several minutes. That was the vulnerability. If they could neutralize guards one by one during these routine visits, they could accumulate weapons and reduce the number of armed guards before launching the general uprising. The guards being systematically eliminated would provide weapons. By the time the SS realized something was wrong, enough guards would be incapacitated that the remaining forces would be overwhelmed. The critical element was timing. They needed to neutralize enough guards to make the uprising viable, but they couldn't afford to have bodies discovered before they were ready to move. The plan required perfect coordination across multiple workshop locations, simultaneous actions by different teams, and then immediate transition to mass escape before reinforcements arrived. They selected October 14, 1943 for specific reasons. Intelligence from prisoners who worked in the SS administrative area indicated that the camp commandant, Franz Reichleitner, would be absent that day on official business. His deputy, Johann Niemann, would be in charge. Removing Niemann early in the operation would leave the SS guards leaderless, increasing confusion. Additionally, October 14th was a Thursday, midweek, when routines were most predictable and guard alertness might be lower than on Mondays or Fridays. The plan was distributed to key conspirators the night before. Small teams, mostly 2 or 3 men each, were assigned specific targets. They would use handcrafted weapons, axes from the carpentry shop, knives from the tailor shop, makeshift clubs. Once SS officers arrived for their appointments, they would be quickly neutralized, their weapons taken, and their bodies hidden. The operation would begin at 4:00 p.m. with Niemann's elimination in the tailor shop. Other eliminations would follow at 15-minute intervals as different SS officers made their scheduled visits to workshops. By 5 p.m., enough guards would be neutralized and enough weapons captured to arm the uprising leaders. At 5 p.m., during regular roll call when prisoners normally assembled, the signal would be given and the mass escape would begin. What made this plan audacious was its ambition. They weren't planning a small escape of a few prisoners. They were planning to liberate the entire camp, roughly 600 prisoners, simultaneously. They understood that leaving anyone behind would result in those prisoners being immediately eliminated in retaliation. The uprising had to succeed completely, or it would fail catastrophically. October 14, 1943, began like any other day in Sobibor. Prisoners woke at dawn, received minimal rations, and were assigned to work details. Most had no idea that this day would be different. The conspiracy leaders went about their assigned tasks, waiting for 4:00 p.m. At 4:00 p.m. precisely, Johann Niemann walked into the tailor workshop. Pechersky and another conspirator, Yehuda Lerner, were waiting. They showed Niemann the leather coat they had prepared. As Niemann examined it with his back turned, Lerner struck him with an axe. Niemann fell. They struck him again to ensure he wouldn't cry out. The deputy commandant of Sobibor, the man who had overseen the extermination of thousands, was neutralized in seconds. They stripped Niemann of his weapons, a pistol and a knife, hid his body under blankets in the corner of the workshop, and waited. One target eliminated, they had 1 hour to neutralize enough other guards before discovery became inevitable. At 4:15 p.m., SS Oberscharführer Josef Vallaster entered the shoemaker's workshop for a fitting. The prisoner workers showed him boots they had crafted. As Vallaster tried them on, conspirators struck from behind. Vallaster was incapacitated, his weapons taken, his body hidden, 2 targets eliminated. At 4:30 p.m., SS Scharführer Rudolf Beckmann arrived at the carpentry workshop to select furniture pieces. He was shown into a side room where finished items were stored. Prisoners struck him with axes and hammers. 3 guards eliminated. The operation was working. But it was also taking longer than planned. Each elimination required several minutes. Not just the attack, but securing weapons, hiding bodies, and ensuring no blood was visible that might alert the next target. The 15-minute intervals were tight. Any delay risked discovery. At 4:45 p.m. there was nearly a catastrophic mistake. An SS guard arrived at one of the workshops earlier than expected, before the assigned team was ready. The prisoners improvised. They showed the guard some items, claimed they weren't quite finished, and asked him to return in 10 minutes. Somehow it worked. The guard left, giving them time to prepare. When he returned, they were ready. By 5 p.m., approximately 9 SS guards had been eliminated. Not all the planned targets. Some SS officers had changed their routines or didn't arrive as expected, but enough. The conspirators had accumulated several pistols, rifles, and ammunition. More importantly, the SS command structure had been decapitated. The most senior guards were eliminated. The remaining guards were younger, less experienced enlisted men. At 5 p.m. roll call was scheduled. Normally, prisoners would assemble in the main yard, guards would count them, and they would be dismissed to their barracks. Today, the roll call would be different. Pechersky and the conspiracy leaders armed themselves with the captured weapons. They moved toward the main yard where prisoners were assembling. The signal was given, a shout in Russian, "Comrades, forward!" and the uprising began. Armed prisoners moved toward the guard towers and the main gate. Other prisoners, now understanding that an uprising was happening, rushed toward the fences. Some prisoners were still confused. 18 months of conditioning had taught them that resistance meant execution. The psychological difficulty of transitioning from victim to fighter in seconds cannot be overstated. Gunfire erupted. The remaining SS guards, now realizing what was happening, opened fire from guard towers. Some prisoners were hit in the initial volleys. Others hesitated, unsure whether to run toward the fences or take cover. The organized uprising was transitioning into chaos. Pechersky and the armed conspirators returned fire at the guard towers, giving other prisoners covering fire as they rushed the fences. The main gate was chained and too heavily defended. Prisoners ran toward the fences at the camp's perimeter, attempting to cut through barbed wire or simply throw blankets over it and climb. The SS guards activated the minefield that surrounded the camp's perimeter. Explosions ripped through groups of escaping prisoners. The mines had been placed to prevent escapes from outside, but were now being detonated by prisoners escaping from inside. Bodies flew through the air. Survivors scrambled over their fallen comrades and kept running. Later testimony from survivors describes these moments as surreal. The camp that had represented death and hopelessness suddenly became a battleground where prisoners were fighting back. Some prisoners who had thought themselves broken beyond repair found themselves running toward freedom with energy they didn't know they possessed. Others froze, unable to process what was happening quickly enough to act. SS reinforcements were called from nearby installations, but it took time for them to arrive. The crucial minutes immediately after 5 p.m. determined who lived and who didn't. Prisoners who reached the fences early and crossed the minefields before guards could concentrate their fire had the best chance. Those who hesitated or were in buildings farther from the perimeter faced longer runs under increasingly heavy fire. Approximately 300 prisoners successfully breached the perimeter and escaped into the forests surrounding Sobibor. Another 300 or so were caught in the camp, unable to reach the fences in time, or were halted by mines or gunfire. But here's what makes this moment significant. 300 prisoners escaping from an extermination camp was unprecedented. The SS had built Sobibor to be inescapable. The psychological conditioning, the physical barriers, the collective punishment system, all of it was designed to make exactly this kind of mass uprising impossible. And it had failed. What happened next revealed both the achievement and the tragedy of Sobibor. The 300 prisoners who escaped entered the forests around Sobibor with almost no supplies, limited weapons, and no clear plan beyond get away from the camp. They were in occupied Poland, where the German military controlled the territory and collaborators might report them. They had to evade German search parties, find food and shelter, and somehow survive until Allied forces could liberate the region. The escapees split into small groups. Some headed toward the Bug River, hoping to cross into Soviet-controlled territory. Others tried to blend into Polish communities, hiding their identities. Some joined partisan groups operating in the forests. Each group faced different fates. German forces launched massive manhunts. They deployed soldiers, police, and collaborators to recapture escapees. Some prisoners were captured within days. Others survived in hiding for weeks before being discovered. Local Polish population's reactions varied. Some Poles helped escapees, risking their own lives to provide food or shelter. Others betrayed escapees to German authorities, either from anti-Semitism or fear of German retaliation for helping Jews. Of the approximately 300 who initially escaped, roughly 50 to 70 survived until the end of the conflict. The exact number is uncertain because tracking individuals through partisan groups Soviet military service, and the chaos of Eastern Europe in 1944–1945 is difficult. Some joined Soviet partisan units and fought German forces for the next 2 years. Others hid with sympathetic Polish families until liberation. A few made it to Soviet territory and survived there. Alexander Pechersky was among the survivors. He crossed into Soviet-controlled territory, rejoined the Soviet army, and fought until Germany's surrender. After the conflict, he faced suspicion from Soviet authorities. He had been captured by Germans and survived, which automatically made him suspect in Stalin's USSR. He was questioned extensively about his time in German captivity and at Sobibor. The NKVD wanted to know if he had collaborated, if the uprising had been some kind of German deception, if he could be trusted. Pechersky spent years trying to clear his name with Soviet authorities. He wrote detailed accounts of Sobibor and the uprising, hoping to document what had happened. But Soviet authorities suppressed his accounts. Why? Because acknowledging that Soviet POWs had been sent to extermination camps raised uncomfortable questions about why the Soviet government hadn't done more to help them. Additionally, the fact that Jews had been specifically targeted for extermination complicated the Soviet narrative that everyone suffered equally under German occupation. Pechersky lived the rest of his life in the Soviet Union, working ordinary jobs, unable to discuss publicly what had happened at Sobibor. His accounts were censored. His heroism went unrecognized. When he died in 1990, shortly before the Soviet Union's collapse, he was virtually unknown outside a small circle of historians who studied Sobibor. Leon Feldhendler, the Polish Jewish prisoner who had been Pechersky's co-conspirator and had helped plan the uprising, survived the escape and hid in Poland until liberation. But his fate was particularly tragic. In April 1945, just weeks after Germany surrendered and mere days after his region was liberated, Feldhendler was murdered. Polish nationalist partisans who opposed Jewish survivors returning to reclaim property shot him. He survived the extermination camp, survived the uprising, survived hiding in occupied Poland, only to be murdered by his own countrymen after liberation. The fate of Sobibor itself revealed how thoroughly the uprising had accomplished its goal. After the October 14th uprising, the SS never reopened the camp. Initially, they planned to recapture all the escapees and resume operations. But Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, ordered Sobibor's complete dismantling. The gas chambers were destroyed, the buildings were razed, trees were planted over the area, and a farm was established on the site to disguise what had been there. Why dismantle a functioning facility? Because the uprising had revealed that even in an extermination camp designed to break human will, resistance remained possible. Keeping Sobibor open after prisoners had successfully revolted would acknowledge that failure. Better to destroy the evidence and move operations elsewhere than to admit that prisoners had defeated the system. Between March 1942 and October 1943, Sobibor had processed approximately 170,000 to 250,000 people to extermination. The number is uncertain because the SS destroyed records and the chaos of the time period made accurate counts impossible. What's certain is that after October 14, 1943, those numbers stopped increasing. The 300 prisoners who escaped didn't just save themselves. They ended Sobibor's operation permanently. Compare this to other extermination camps. Auschwitz, Treblinka, Belzec, all continued operations until Soviet forces physically liberated them or German forces abandoned them during retreat. Only Sobibor was closed directly because of prisoner action. The uprising didn't just allow some prisoners to escape, it destroyed the facility's ability to function. The historical understanding of Sobibor has evolved significantly over decades. Immediately after the conflict, the uprising was barely known. The few survivors were scattered across the Soviet Union, Poland, and eventually Israel. They couldn't communicate easily, and those in the Soviet Union faced censorship. The camp's location in Poland, which became part of the Soviet sphere of influence, meant Western researchers couldn't access the site. It wasn't until the 1960s that survivors began connecting with each other and sharing their stories publicly. Trials of former SS guards in the 1960s brought more attention to Sobibor. The testimony of survivors at these trials provided documentation of what had happened. But even then, Sobibor remained less well known than Auschwitz or other camps that had more survivors and better documentation. The archaeology of Sobibor has been particularly challenging. Because the SS destroyed the camp so thoroughly and planted vegetation to hide it, determining exactly where structures stood proved difficult. Archaeological excavations beginning in the 2000s have slowly revealed the camp's layout. They've found foundations of gas chambers, personal items from victims, and evidence confirming survivor testimonies. One particularly moving discovery came in 2014. Archaeologists found a pendant in the area where women were forced to undress before extermination. The pendant had a Hebrew inscription. It was a small, personal item someone had hidden, hoping perhaps to keep this one piece of identity even in the face of elimination. Finding it 70 years later connected the archaeological evidence to the human reality of what happened there. The number of survivors who could testify about Sobibor dwindled over the decades. By the 21st century, only a handful remained alive. Each death represented the loss of irreplaceable first-hand testimony. Thomas Blatt, one of the uprising participants who survived and later moved to the United States, spent decades speaking about Sobibor at schools and institutions. He testified at trials of former SS guards and wrote extensively about his experiences. When he died in 2015, the community of Sobibor survivors lost one of their most articulate voices. The uprising's legacy raises complex questions about resistance under impossible conditions. For decades, there was criticism of Jewish populations during the Holocaust for going like sheep to slaughter, the implication being that victims should have fought back more. This criticism was profoundly unjust and ignorant of the actual conditions people faced. Sobibor demonstrated exactly why resistance was so difficult. The camp was designed to break human will. Prisoners were starved, brutalized, kept in ignorance of their fate until too late, and subjected to collective punishment that made individual resistance seem like selfish endangerment of others. The fact that any resistance occurred at all is remarkable. The fact that resistance succeeded even once is almost miraculous. But Sobibor also demonstrated that resistance, while nearly impossible, was not completely impossible. With planning, leadership, some luck, and extraordinary courage, prisoners accomplished what the SS thought they had made impossible. This doesn't diminish the tragedy of those who couldn't resist. It highlights the exceptional circumstances required for resistance to succeed. The lesson isn't, why didn't more people resist? The lesson is, under what conditions does resistance become possible, and how can we prevent such conditions from ever existing again? Modern military and security planners study Sobibor for different reasons than historians. They study it as a case of successful resistance under extreme adversity. How did Pechersky and Feldhendler organize securely under constant surveillance? How did they maintain operational security with hundreds of potential participants? How did they overcome the psychological barriers that kept prisoners compliant? The answers provide insights into resistance, leadership, and human psychology under extreme stress. Pechersky's military training proved crucial. His understanding of command structures, tactical planning, and operational security enabled planning that desperate individuals couldn't achieve. Feldhendler's institutional knowledge of the camp's routines provided the vulnerabilities that training could exploit. But beyond tactics and planning, there was the psychological transformation required. Prisoners had been conditioned to believe resistance was impossible and would doom everyone. Breaking that conditioning required not just a plan, but a shift in how prisoners saw themselves, from victims waiting for termination to agents capable of action. The uprising's timing proved significant in ways the conspirators couldn't have fully anticipated. October 1943 was when German forces were being pushed back on the Eastern Front. The Battle of Kursk in July 1943 had marked the last major German offensive. By October, Soviet forces were advancing. The German military was increasingly desperate. This desperation affected how the SS operated the extermination camps. Originally, Operation Reinhard was supposed to be completed by the end of 1943, with all three extermination camps, Sobibor, Belzec and Treblinka, being dismantled and hidden. The Sobibor Uprising accelerated this timeline for that specific camp, but it occurred within a broader context of the SS, trying to destroy evidence of systematic extermination before Allied forces could discover it. So while the uprising directly caused Sobibor's closure, that closure was probably inevitable within months anyway. What the uprising accomplished was ensuring it happened immediately and ensuring that 300 prisoners escaped, rather than being eliminated as the camp was closed down. This doesn't diminish the achievement, it contextualizes it. The prisoners didn't just resist, they correctly assessed that their window for action was closing and acted decisively. Their timing, intentional or fortunate, probably saved lives that would have been lost if they had waited even a few more weeks. The commemoration of Sobibor has been complicated by Cold War politics and the site's location. The camp was in Poland, which became communist after the conflict and allied with the Soviet Union. Access to the site was restricted. The Soviet and Polish communist governments had complex relationships with Holocaust memory. They acknowledged atrocities, but downplayed specifically Jewish suffering in favor of narratives emphasizing general suffering under occupation. Monuments erected at Sobibor in the immediate post-conflict period often referenced Polish citizens or victims, without specifically mentioning that the overwhelming majority were Jewish. This reflected broader Soviet bloc policy of universalizing suffering rather than acknowledging targeted genocide. Only after the Soviet Union's collapse in 1991 did more complete commemoration become possible. New monuments explicitly referenced Jewish victims and the uprising. Museums were established providing fuller historical context. Survivors who had been unable to visit during the Soviet era finally could return to the site. In 2003, a major commemoration marked the 60th anniversary of the uprising. Surviving participants gathered at the site. They were elderly, most in their 80s. They shared memories and honored the roughly 250 who had escaped but not survived to see liberation. The event was emotional and also served as a reunion for people who had shared one of history's most extraordinary experiences but had been separated for 6 decades. Alexander Pechersky never attended these commemorations. He died in 1990, before the Soviet Union's collapse made such gatherings possible. His family attended on his behalf, carrying his memories and his accounts. They brought documents he had written, his detailed descriptions of the planning, the execution, the escape that Soviet censors had suppressed for decades. Reading Pechersky's accounts reveals his remarkable clarity about what they accomplished and what they couldn't accomplish. He understood that the uprising saved some people but couldn't save everyone. He understood that many who escaped were captured and executed later. He carried survivors' guilt about those who didn't make it. He spent his life trying to ensure their story was told, even when authorities tried to suppress it. The question that haunts Sobibor survivors and historians is, could other camps have staged similar uprisings? The conditions that made Sobibor's uprising possible were unique. Pechersky's military training, the timing of his arrival, the presence of Leon Feldhendler with his institutional knowledge, the specific vulnerabilities in Sobibor's routine, all these factors aligned in ways they might not have elsewhere. Treblinka saw an uprising on August 2, 1943, 2 months before Sobibor. About 200 prisoners escaped, though most were captured. The Treblinka uprising was less organized than Sobibor's and resulted in more immediate casualties among prisoners. Treblinka was closed shortly after, similar to Sobibor, with the SS choosing to dismantle rather than continue operations after prisoners had demonstrated resistance. Auschwitz-Birkenau saw a revolt by Sonderkommando prisoners in October 1944. prisoners forced to work in the gas chambers and crematoria. They destroyed one of the crematoria and inflicted casualties on SS guards before being overwhelmed. All participants were executed, but they damaged infrastructure and disrupted operations temporarily. These examples suggest that resistance was possible in multiple camps under specific conditions, but they also demonstrate why it was so rare. The conditions required: leadership, organization, weapons or tools, timing and courage rarely aligned. Sobibor's success was extraordinary precisely because all these elements somehow came together. The ethical questions raised by Sobibor remain uncomfortable. The uprising required eliminating SS guards to obtain weapons. The guards were struck from behind without warning, often while looking at items prisoners had crafted for them. By any conventional moral standard, this would be considered murder. But conventional moral standards assume a baseline of humanity and law that did not exist in Sobibor. The guards were participants in systematic extermination. They were executing people daily. The moral calculus in such extreme conditions defies normal categorization. Survivors consistently reject any moral equivalence between their actions and those of the SS. As one survivor stated, "They question whether we had the right to take their lives to save ours. They never question whether the SS had the right to take hundreds of thousands of innocent lives for nothing." The uprising also required keeping the plan secret from most prisoners until the last moment. This meant that some prisoners were caught completely unprepared when the chaos began. They hadn't mentally prepared for action. Some froze or hesitated when they should have run. Organizers couldn't tell everyone in advance, because the more people who knew, the greater the chance of discovery. This created a tragic situation where some prisoners might have survived if they'd known the uprising was coming, but were caught off guard and couldn't react quickly enough. The organizers had to accept that operational security might cost lives to give the plan any chance of success. There was no morally clean choice. Survivors described the psychological weight of these decisions. Pechersky reportedly spent the rest of his life wondering if he could have saved more people if he'd planned differently. But second-guessing ignores that he was operating under impossible constraints with incomplete information and time pressure. His plan worked better than any reasonable expectation suggested it could. The legacy of Sobibor is ultimately about possibility under impossible conditions. For 18 months, the SS had operated an extermination camp that processed thousands of people to death with mechanical efficiency. They believed they had created a system where resistance was psychologically and physically impossible. They believed they had broken human will so completely that prisoners would comply with their own elimination. On October 14, 1943, 600 prisoners proved that belief wrong. Not all survived, not all escaped. But enough did to demonstrate that even in humanity's darkest moment, in a place designed to destroy hope, resistance remained possible. The prisoners of Sobibor didn't just fight for themselves. They fought for human dignity, for the principle that people retain agency even when oppressors try to strip it away, for the idea that evil can be resisted even when resistance seems futile. They won. Not completely. Too many didn't survive. Too many died during the escape or were captured afterward. But they won enough to matter. They closed Sobibor forever. They ensured that at least some lived to testify about what happened. They proved that the SS system, as powerful and terrifying as it was, could be defeated. Remember Sobibor. Remember October 14, 1943. Remember that 600 prisoners facing certain elimination chose to fight. Remember that 300 escaped. Remember that 50 to 70 survived to bear witness. Remember that one small uprising ended an extermination camp's operation and saved an unknowable number of lives by preventing future transports from being processed there. Remember that resistance is possible, even when everything suggests it isn't, even when the odds are overwhelming, even when success seems impossible. The prisoners of Sobibor proved it, and their proof matters still.